Right, so today I'm going to talk about one of the issues which is the most divisive and controversial. No, it's not Brexit. I'm going to talk today about economics, really. Now, in politics and economics, between those on the left and the right, and sometimes in the centre, there are two very clear and distinct ideologies. On the one hand, there's the socially democratic Keynesian approach to the economy. On the other hand, there's a free market neoliberal approach. Now, both have positives and negatives, both have contradictions and etc. Now, in the early 1900s, Britain had conservative and liberal governments. And the Liberal government of then Prime Minister David Lloyd George oversaw many of the basic welfare protections, so pension acts, free meals for people, and basic healthcare needs. And these were seen as Keynesian approaches to the economy. And these were carried through with fairly understood consensus. Winston Churchill himself, although a conservative, was arguably a Keynesian. Now, that ran very well and very smooth until the Great Depression in 1929, when they ran the question of could you see Keynesian economics whilst there was a financial crash. Now, those on the right argued you need to cut spending, which is you have less money going in, so you've got lower debt. The other approach is that you actually spend more money. Now, a lot of people question how you could do this. But the theory is if you put more money into the economy, you have bigger investment, then the economy is getting bigger, it's getting a bigger surplus, it's getting a bigger drive, it's getting a bigger investment. Now, by 1945, Britain had been ravaged by war, and the then Conservative government had pushed Britain's state involvement far beyond what most Conservative governments would have done. But for many voters, it just simply wasn't enough. And the 1945 Labour manifesto, although compared to now maybe not so big, it was a big change from the previous policies. It promised a big expansion of the welfare state. It promised nationalisation, public ownership of key industries, utilities and services, and the creation of a national health service. Now, the person behind these recommendations was a man called William Beveridge. Now, he was a liberal, but he was a Keynesian. He came from the, if you like, the socially democratic wing of the Liberal Party, and he believed in the good that government could do. And his policies were based around investment, based around government intervention, and that the economy grows and public services do well when the government takes a real hands-on approach to that. So the Labour government, both parties accepted the recommendations, the Labour government even more so. Now, the National Health Service was spearheaded by a man, and I'll go into this later in some of the other videos, called Aaron Bevan. Now, although he would be seen nowadays as actually soft left, pragmatic left, he was seen as very much on the left of the party. He was came from a former coal miner, came from that kind of places, and he pushed against fierce opposition, not just from the Conservatives, who had against it more than 100 times, but also from the British Medical Association, because it would mean less profit for doctors and less money for the insurance industries. But he pushed that through. Now, the Tories in 1951, they won, although they actually got less votes than Labour, but the first past the post system results and things like that. It accepted broad amounts of Labour thinking. Now, it's often said there was a post-war consensus, but there is a question as to what degree there is. Because, for example, Conservative governments placed more benefits on what the markets could do. Labour governments were more into state involvement. But the Conservative government accepted many proposals. Labour's National Health Service, of course it would, and key industries being publicly owned. However, when Labour came back into power in 1964, some industries were re-nationalised. Labour raised wages, it raised taxes on the wealthy, and it enacted basic social protections. Now, that worked pretty well for the next 30, 40 years. But state intervention, high taxes on the wealthy, had proved difficult till that time. Now, the Conservative Party broadly accepted those proposals. Edward Heath was a very interventionist Tory. But he was challenged by a one Margaret Roberts Thatcher. She won the leadership in the shock, and she took Britain to the right. She dismantled many of the key elements of social democracy, heavy taxation, public ownership. Now, there is always a debate on the left and the right what Mrs. Thatcher did. People on the right argue that she brought inflation down, she restored Britain's pride, but men on the left argue, and fairly so, that her policies saw huge unemployment, that many other countries faced the same problems, but they worked constructively, and that the manner of Thatcherism, of huge deregulation, of kind of wanting to just beat the trade unions with a stick, and the huge inequality, the amount of mines that were closed, the heavy deregulation, and many communities have never recovered. But there's one other element which raises the key questions about Thatcherism. Now, in 2008, the financial centre of the world came crashing down, the financial crash. Now, a lot of conservatives argue that Labour spending was responsible. Now, there is a question of whether it was. Debt interest may have had an impact, but the key conclusion from independent experts, from former ministers, is it was a deregulation. Now, Glass-Steagall, part of the Keynesian approach was in the United States. Now, President Roosevelt in the 1930s established what we call in modern day Glass-Steagall. So it separated community and investment banking, so personal business banking. So it stopped corporations getting too greedy, it stopped banks from, over-betting, and it stopped a housing market crash. But in the boom of the 90s, in the whole neoliberal approach, it was deregulated. Now, this caused strong economic growth for the first amount of time, for a while. But it caused a financial crash, it caused the whole centres to come crashing down. Now, the response of many in Europe was to cut taxes for the super wealthy, was huge austerity and privatisation. Economically, employment has come down, but there has been huge inequality, inflation has risen, inequality has risen, and Britain has had the slowest economic recovery since the Napoleonic Wars. Now, these two philosophies often come with caveats and negatives. Us, myself on the left and many on the right would agree. Too much of a socialist approach drives away investors, and it can cause downward effects. But the Thatcherite model causes division, and in many aspects sowed the seeds for the world financial crash.